Thank you, Rahul, and please stay with me here. Now, let's dive into all the action, right? This is the ninth Dynamic CISO Summit, and the action is picking steam here and out there on social media. Now, hashtag CISO Summit 2022, that's hashtag CISO Summit 2022 is your digital destination, and we urge you to head there on LinkedIn and Twitter as we all dive into the summit. Now, you've read enough and more about breaches and attacks, and a few of us have experienced that in close proximity. Our first keynote of the day is all about understanding the anatomy of a data breach. To talk to us about it, let's connect across to Tim Brown, the VP of Security at SolarWinds, who's in conversation with Rahul. Rahul, back to you.
All right. Thank you, Ashwin, and a very warm welcome to all of you for this ninth edition of Dynamic CISO Summit and Excellence Award. I just wish we could be face-to-face for this one. However, in the planning stage itself, the Omicron strain stole the thunder from us, and we are compelled to do it virtually. Nonetheless, we are here with a huge lineup of great experts and professionals as speakers. And indeed, we are going to begin this whole conference with a bang. While the much talked about SolarWinds breach in late 2020 brought a dangerous attack vector to the fore, however, software supply chain attacks are far from any new phenomenon. These attacks happen when hackers or attackers infiltrate a software provider's network and infects the supply chain with a malicious code to compromise the software. According to Gartner, by 2025, about 45% organizations globally will have experienced attacks on their software supply chains, which is a threefold increase, from 2021. Attackers are rampantly targeting the software, especially the open source software. These attacks are very sophisticated. The threat actors don't leave a single opportunity to exploit the vulnerability in the software development lifecycle to inject malicious code and install a backdoor to impact the post-development patch and updates. Apart from SolarWinds, which was much talked about, there were many other major attacks which included Kaseya, Codeco, Log4j. In each case, the attraction for the attacker is that a single breach, compromise, or vulnerability in distributed code can lead to multiple, even thousands of victims. So, to talk about the software supply chain attacks and give us a first-person account of what happened in the SolarWinds case, we have with us none other than Tim Brown, who is the CISO of SolarWinds. Now, Tim has been in the industry since 1987, so calling him a veteran won't be an exaggeration. Prior to his current role, Tim has worked in senior leadership positions with Dell, CA Technologies, Symantec, and many other organizations. Welcome to the summit, Tim. It's an honor to have you with us.
Thanks, Rahul. It's great to be here.
Excellent. So let me begin with asking you, the dust of 2020 SolarWinds hack has still not settled. As the CISO of the famous software company, how did you see the breach unfolding? Can you please decode the whole incident for our listeners in a nutshell?
Yeah, absolutely. So, ours was unique in a lot of ways, right? And we've been looking to make sure that, when we share the story, we help others, right? And that's a big part of sharing. And that's what we've always tried to do. So let me give you a few details. So December 20th, a little bit over a year ago, we got a call from the FireEye CEO. And he said, hey, we think, you may have been shipping tainted code. I got a call from our CEO and said, okay, we're going to have a call with the CTO. So I got in a call with Charles, the CTO for FireEye, and he said, now here's what we have, right? Here's what we see. Normally in a breach or an incident of any type, you have to do investigation to determine, hey, is this real? And you spend days doing that. In this case, FireEye said, here's the code that you shipped, right? Here's the decompiled code that was shipped out of your version. So with that decompiled code, we could see, hey, this wasn't ours, right? So our investigation started very quickly, and so the question came back to, okay, what happened, right? How did we ship tainted code? What went on, right? And we figured out that tainted code was in 3 versions. Those versions were produced between March and June of 2020. And so we're looking at that and saying, oh, it's in our source code. Is it anywhere? Can we find this source code that the decompiled code represented? And the answer was no. It was nowhere to be found in source code control, nowhere to be found in history, nowhere to be found anywhere. So it's like, okay, how did that get there, right? And that's one of the big kind of internal investigations what we had going on. At the beginning, of course, for an incident, you spin up all sorts of different things, right? You spin up a threat hunt on the internal infrastructure. You spin up bring in third parties. We brought in CrowdStrike to help us with our internal investigation. And we brought in KPMG's forensics team to help with the investigation of the build environments, because we knew that the build system had been corrupted in some way. So fast forward a little bit, build system was corrupted, right? And we searched for build systems across our environment that were present during that period, right? From that March to June period, we had to find one that was there. The only way one would be there is if it crashed, because we build them, essentially all the time. So we found one that was crashed. We found, with it being crashed, we were able to identify the insertion point. We published that. It's called Sunspot when we published it. It was basically a Windows service that inserted that code, and that inside of Sunspot was the Sunburst code. Sunspot code was attached to a transient virtual machine. So it was attached to a virtual machine that acted as a worker thread. We're building Orion that's 12 products. It's a complex build system. TeamCity is an orchestrator. So it's spawning off these things. It spawns off a virtual machine that had a Sunspot code. That Sunspot code looked for a certain component to be built, appended the Sunburst code to it, went away, cleaned up. We went through, built it, signed it, shipped it. So that's why it really is a supply chain issue. They didn't touch source code control. They didn't touch anywhere in the middle. They touched this transient virtual machine. They were able to insert that code into place that ended up being shipped. So hence supply chain. Threat actor now attributed to Russian SDR. Very sophisticated. It did not waste any cycles, did not do anything that would make them notice, were not noisy in everything that they did. They did a test run in October. So they came in and performed that Sunspot insertion in October that did nothing. So they proved that they could do the insertion in October. They came back in March with 2,500 lines of code that never got changed between March and June. And then they cleaned up and went away. The code they dropped didn't start for 14 days, would not run inside my environments, my test environments, and other environments. So very sophisticated, very mission-centric, not a lot of noise. And that's what made it very hard to circumvent them in the process. So that gives you a quick overlay of kind of who they are, what we did, and kind of the investigations that went through.
Sorry to say this. It looks, to me, it looks a very fascinating Hollywood plot. Oh. And the way you have explained it, it certainly makes a great script for a blockbuster. However, going a little down the road, when you got to understand that there was some mischief which has happened, things are going a little out of control, and when you were having a back and forth discussion with the FireEye folks, how did you get into a damage control mode with all the other ecosystem players?
Yeah, great question. I mean, this is the event quickly spiraled into something that was, on CNN and the Wall Street Journal and everywhere across the world, right? So the amount of different partners coming for good and bad were, everybody was involved, right? So we had CISA involved. We had the national defenders for every organization in the world calling us and saying, were any of our systems affected? At that point in time, we were trying to develop, the virus for COVID. So governments were worried about, are any of these entities affected that were developing COVID? So the amount of questions and real kind of investigations that had to go on from who was affected was great. A lot of the researchers were coming in and providing, data on the back end, and some of it very good, a lot of it very good. But a lot of the researchers have their own, agendas to work through to be able to build up their business, right? And I'm never against commercial activities. But that's just a fact, right? The CISOs of the world were more looking at, how do we give the real message? Who was affected? Who was not affected? What affected really meant? And in this instance, it could have been worse, right? In this instance, the code that the threat actor put down required an internet connection, required you to go to a command and control server, required that to happen, and then required action on the other side. So the code that was written very specifically to target certain, we believe, to target certain companies and certain institutions as opposed to do general harm. So a lot of people that network control software, so many folks put network control software cordoned off inside their network and say, hey, you don't talk to anybody, right, except for our internal systems. Those people weren't affected. They had the code there, but the code never reached a stage 2. So during this process, researchers are giving more information. People are diagnosing the Sunburst code, diagnosing the Sunspark code, diagnosing everything, publishing a great deal of information. So probably one of the most researched models. And then it was just, how do we get the customers right? So we started publishing with the national defenders. Hey, here's what you have to worry about. Have you seen, command and control activity? Have you seen C2 activity? If you have, here's what you do. If you haven't, please upgrade to a version that's not affected. So a lot of that went on. So all different streams during a incident, we really had 5 or 6 streams that were going on. Internal IT, engineering, communications, government affairs, law enforcement, all having separate managed streams to be able to give a response to the world that was needed.
So, again, I'm going a little off track from a cliched set of questions that I had prepared, but this story is unfolding in a very, very interesting manner. More often than not, we have seen that law enforcement and policymakers, for example, in the US, CISA or FBI, are very quick to respond to such incidents, because for them, doing damage control is the foremost exercise that they need to do to safeguard the interests of their own country as well as for the rest of the world. So how was SolarWinds handling the pressure, or how was SolarWinds handling the questions, interrogations being done by these law enforcement agencies?
Yeah, so I think they're absolutely pressured, right? I mean, you're talking, 4 weeks or 5 or 6 weeks of, no sleep and, basically 18-hour days and losing 20 pounds and all of those good things, right? So a lot of pressure, but a lot of necessary answers to be done. So we compartmentalized a number of different things. So FBI and law enforcement were handling attribution. If you look at the amount of time I spent on attribution, it was minimal. It was, wow, I think this is sophisticated, right? And great, we have other things to focus on. So law enforcement does that. CISA and National Defender is a great partner in saying, amplifying the message. That was what their job was, to amplify the truth. The truth was, if you're running these versions, you're safe. If you're running these versions, you need to look deeper to see whether you've been affected. if you're doing this, and this is what you should do if you were affected. So that worked closely with CISA through this environment, and then use that as an example for the rest of the world. Kind of what we took on. And yes, we had House, Senate testimonies. You had to, you had to have a little bit of a hard shell, right? If you paid attention to all of the misinformation that was going on, I did not fix the U.S. election. I did not get raided by the FBI to my office. I did not. So the amount of misinformation you just have to ignore during this cycle. Because if you got to try to defend yourself on every point, you would be spending all your time defending and not spending the time getting your customers in a better spot.
Okay, so I'll come back to some of these more fascinating, interesting questions a little bit later. But tell me something. Maybe it's a very naive question, but why Orion? Why did hackers choose Orion? I mean, explain. Also, can you describe the various stages of the attack? How it unfolded?
Yeah. So when you look at Orion, it has been around for about 20 years, right? And focus, for those folks who don't know, really network management, systems management, application management, and it's a fantastic product, right? The product is number one for network management from IDC. So it's been around, has a footprint, right? So that's first off why Orion. Second piece for it is we pride ourselves on being able to be, simple, powerful, affordable. We pride ourselves in allowing people to download and try the product, right? We pride ourselves in that is our business model. We don't have a big consulting teams going out and doing implementation. So from an adversary perspective, they can download, they can play, they can learn, right? From a footprint perspective, we have a footprint that is a good footprint. We have, footprints in many ways. So when from an attractive target perspective, so one of the things that people believe, which is, incorrect, is that the Sunburst malware gave you access to the SolarWinds data. And the data that the Orion product had actually just gave you access to a Windows box that was running Orion as a privileged user. So that's what it did. It gave you a launch point from that perspective. So it didn't try to even steal the data associated with Orion. It simply said, hey, I'm going to launch off from here. I'm going to get a foothold. But the reason for Orion was simply that it has that broad appeal and that broad approach to many. And, a number of theories now later on is that they actually had specifically targeted certain customers that had their Orion internet facing. And that's why they said, how am I going to get into this environment? Okay, well, Orion will be the way to get into this environment. And I have time, money, patience in order to do that. And they executed, and they executed well, and were able to succeed in what they were trying to do.
Tim, in our earlier conversations, you mentioned that these infiltrators, the bad actors, actually infiltrated, went out, and nothing was visible. They were not traced, and it was very difficult to come to know that something has happened within the systems. So what was the motive behind that? Was it some kind of reconnaissance, or what was it?
Yeah, back to Russian SVR, they weren't there to do noise. They weren't there to have ransomware. They weren't there to disrupt an environment. They were there on a specific mission, right? And they've used compromised email first, right? They compromised the O365. We believe that they did that at the initial deployment of O365 for us. And they were able to read emails. That's one of the reasons why Microsoft believes there was 1,000 people behind the attack. Simply that they took actions based on individuals' activities that were hard to do if you weren't physically having people read emails. So you have reconnaissance going on to understand an environment, then you have an insertion test, and then you have an insertion point. and then you go away. So very, very prescriptive in what they did, and very actions for what they did for their specific purpose. Because they could have done many things, right? They could have done that and just said, yep, I'm going to encrypt everything I see, right? Could do so many different things with that payload, but their payload was very specific and very targeted. So, absolutely a mission. I mean, this one of the things we try to make sure people realize is that this threat actor type and this threat actor model is not just from the movies, right? This threat actor is true, that they are real, they are motivated, quiet, stealthy, very difficult to stop. And we have made a lot of steps that now make our environment much more resilient to this type of attack. But it steps over and beyond what normal kind of development processes are. We're now doing, we did validated builds in July. Now we're doing triple builds with, no one person having access to all three. So in order to affect my build environment today, you would have to get collusion between multiple people, three, and have, architects actually corrupted in order to affect my build today. So we've gone over and above on, build environments, over and above on the IT group. So just things like really assuming breach inside of our environment across the board. That really sets us up to make it, is it impossible? Never, right? Never think it's impossible. Is it much harder to get into my environment today? No question whatsoever. And to affect my builds, you'll need to get insiders. You'll need to get collusion. You'll need to have multiple people colluding in the environment. Is it impossible? No, but it's much, much harder from that perspective.
So indeed, I mean, these are hard lessons. I mean, lessons learned the hard way. However, I also wanted to ask you a very specific question about, this whole momentum, which is shifting from real information to fake information and disinformation. Because since the time the attack unfolded and it came in public domain, there were various assumptions made about the quantum of impact. And in the end, if I'm not wrong, the quantum of impact was not as widespread as it was
originally
given in the press. So, how did you manage to get to the root of what is the quantum of impact of this whole attack?
Yeah. So originally we put out, when we filed our reports, right, we said that 18,000 customers had downloaded an affected version.
Yeah.
Now, when we further on, right, we didn't want to be in the situation of saying, oh, it was 10,000, it was 100, it was 200, oh, then it keeps growing, right? And that was, potentially a calculated risk and maybe wrong, right? But we said 18,000 because that's who downloaded it. And then when we look at it, now we're down to, well under 100 affected agencies. The GAO, Government Affairs Organization from the U.S., published a paper. So they're the audit area of the U.S. government. They said, originally we thought that 9 U.S. agencies were potentially compromised. They said it was 4. And then commercial entities, very, very few. So 100 is very generous. It's probably closer to well under 50, well under 20. So that again, it was a mission, it was a target, it was a specific model for this specific piece of code that was running and the way it was designed. So the way that we got onto that was a number of researchers looked and said, who called these command and control servers? How much activity was the command and control server showing? And what were those entities that were showing activity to command and control servers? So the software was present on that many customers' environments, but how many actually reached out to the command and control server and that they cared about? Much, 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 much fewer. So, but the message for the world should be, it could have been worse, right? It could have had more impact. They could have just done damage to those 18,000. So it's important people understand truly what was affected and be able to kind of amplify that kind of model and the truth of what was going on. But it's very hard in the first days of an incident to get to a real number, and we didn't want to downplay it and then be wrong. So yeah, hindsight gives us a lot more clarity and vision of exactly what kind of occurred, but you just don't have that in the first month.
Excellent. So, taking a segue from what you just said, I would like you to focus on a little bit on some of the key lessons that you learned during and post this breach or attack, and how can CISOs, in a larger context, be prepared from these? I mean, what can they learn from these lessons and be better prepared?
Yeah, so a number of different lessons, right? So always prevention, always understanding kind of what your crown jewels are, always understanding that you should reach to an assumed breach model and do your scenarios, do your red teaming, go above and beyond for those controls that are the most important. That's always lesson one from a prevention perspective. Now, you have to remember that my program prior to the incident was good, right? It was, we were spending a little bit over industry average. I had my SOC, I had multiple domains, I had domain for dev, lab, test, and production. I gave my developers a little too much freedom in what they do. That's a very common thing from an engineering organization. So think about policies, think about what's most important, put the controls in place that really make you have an assumed breach model. So that's kind of one. Then during an incident, the industry is starting to accept that if you are sharing, you're not what's the right word? Crucified, I guess, is a good word.
Absolutely.
On the other side of it. And the sharing, the transparency is helpful, and that it is worthwhile to be transparent. Yeah. It is worthwhile to come out and talk. It is worthwhile to share your lessons so that others can go through that. Make sure you have great communications plans. Make sure you have the right people on speed dial. Make sure that you have very competent people helping you through a process that will be your first time, hopefully, and other people's 100th time. So use the expertise for people going through. And then use the national defenders and your government agencies to help, right? They really can be helpful in, moving forward. And then in your own side, look at what where you can invest in to get the best visibility across the environment. Look at places where you can invest to do your own red teaming, your own adversarial models. So those are some of the lessons that we've learned through it.
It's a very $1 million suggestion. And one thing which I really got stuck in your last answer is transparency. And one should not be ashamed of accepting the fact that something wrong has happened in your environment, and share it with others, because that will help the larger ecosystem. So finally, Tim, what do you propose as tips for empowering the defenders? In the way of red teaming, blue teaming, what do they need to do to prepare with an action plan prior to the incident, during the incident, and post the incident, which includes a great communication plan as well?
Yeah, so I think, there's a lot of things. So from the CISO perspective, make sure you're part of the business, right? Make sure you're communicating to the business. Make sure that you are communicating risk, right? Risk is what you need to be measuring. It's not security, right? Security is not a binary. It's not on or off. So be prepared to communicate risk. Be prepared to make others understand that when you face additional risk. Because from a security professional's perspective, nothing's ever perfect. Everybody always wants more money, more budget, more time, more people. So you have to be able to look at that in the right way and be able to drive those conversations in the right way. So that's kind of number one from a CISO perspective. The other is build your skills, right? And one of the questions that often comes up is, why wasn't I fired? right? That's a very, very common question, believe it or not. Because if you look at the major issues and incidents that have occurred, all of those CISOs are no longer with those companies. So one of the things is to make sure that you build up your communications model, you build up your ability to speak, you build up your ability to help the business. If you're a backroom CISO, if I was a backroom CISO, I should not have been there. I couldn't handle it, right? I wouldn't have been helpful through the incident. So make sure you're building the skills to be kind of the next generation CISO, next generation kind of risk officer for the company. And that will help drive the right models within your companies and help drive, and assess risk in the right way. So simply, making our adversaries' job harder, right? And that's really what our job is.
Excellent. I think you nailed it. And it's again very candid admission when you said that most of the people must be wondering, including myself, that why weren't you fired? Because in the cases right from Target to till now, we have not seen the CISO surviving after such a high-profile breach. However, thank you so much. It was a very, very enriching conversation, Tim. And I must say that the lessons learned by you will percolate down to a larger community, and they will learn their lessons too, in becoming very proactive from what you have suffered. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much as well.